Hey gals, guys and everyone else, I'm Hayze, this is Armored Brownies, and today we are tackling Roadhog's mask. And as you can see, I'm looking at some reference images, but first I need to show you some preliminary work we put into this. Yes, we did some 3D modelling and then some 3D printing for this mask. These are all models that I made myself and then we printed on our new 3D printer. We have an eyepiece, specifically the right size to put a 50mm round sunglass lens in, rather than having to try and scratch build something ourselves. And then the actual filter parts themselves, made in two parts. One part that would be held inside the mask, so the actual bigger part can then slot into it. And as you can see, it's all very simple shapes, but I'm pretty confident they match the original character properly. Now the program you're looking at here is a program called AutoCAD 123D Design, and it's all based around doing these sketches and then extruding them and manipulating the shapes that you create. So it's very easy to actually work with to create nice simple shapes, nice basic geometric patterns, rather than having to learn to use a proper sculpting program like ZBrush or something similar. But back to the sculpt. So as ever, we start by laying down the foundations and the basic shape and where the edges of this mask want to be on the face of the person doing. This is actually my first time trying to combine traditional sculpting in clay with 3D printing, and I believe this is the future, because rather than having to try and sculpt in perfect circles, I can get a 3D printer to create geometrically perfect objects for me that I've already gone and figured out the sizing and scaling of beforehand. Although admittedly I did have to reprint the objects a couple of times to get the scale right, but that's why they call it rapid prototyping. Okay, now you can see me putting marks into the sculpt to figure out where the 3D printed parts are going to go, where they will fit, making sure they're symmetrical, measuring things out, and putting in the grand details on the mask. And once they're in, everything else can start to come together, like putting the nostrils in, starting to put some of the stitches in. And these are quite hard to get right because it's a little bit difficult to put a nice subtle effect that makes them look like a separate material from the rest of the mask. Whilst you're watching, don't forget to drop a like on this video, it helps me out immensely, and comment below what your favourite Overwatch character is. Mine just happens to be Mercy, though I haven't really done much on my Mercy costume yet. But back to this. As I said in the introduction, these 3D printed parts came in two sections, one part that goes inside the mask and one part that goes out of it. And as you can see, here I am burying the socket into the sculpt. So when I cast it, I will just be able to slot a filter straight in there, and the filters themselves will also be cast and moulded. And the filters themselves will also be moulded and cast just like the rest of the mask. I'm not going to 3D print them each and every time, because a 3D printed part should not be used raw, and it would take too much effort to clean up the parts each and every time I wanted to make one of these masks. And we move on and do basically the same thing for the eyes, digging out a nice deep hole for it to go into, and then also having a bit of a trench around the outside of that part, just to make sure that I'm able to trim it out when necessary to put the actual cast version of the lenses in afterwards. And now we start putting in the rest of the details. Since we have the eyes and the filters in the right place, I can start to put in some of the details that go around there, which are the seams and the stitches. And more seams and more stitches on the top here. My first concern is blending the stitches in and then adding the details to them. In fact, this was actually, all the stitches were put in one day and then left to dry out overnight so I could carry on sculpting the details into them the following day. But speaking of the following day, I actually come back and decided that the filters and the eyepieces were about 10% too small. Admittedly, I printed out some 20% bigger parts and then I printed out some 10% bigger parts. And it turns out the 10% bigger parts fit the overall mask a hell of a lot better. As I said before, that's why it's called rapid prototyping. The scale of the first ones was a prototype, and I couldn't really tell how they looked on an actual human scale until they were there in situ. And here I am just replacing them, so never be afraid to go back if you have the resources and try again. And then it's a case of just cleaning up all of the areas around them to make sure they blend as nicely as they did before. And as you can see, suddenly it all looks a hell of a lot better with the extra large eyes. Admittedly, he's got the whole pig motif going on, so you'd expect him to have the little piggy eyes, but he kind of doesn't. Well, actually, I think he does behind the eyes. And now, because the stitches are all have a fabric texture to them, I actually ended up using the laces from my motorcycle boots to press an imprint of fabric laces in them to make sure the stitches had a very different texture to the rest of the mask. And like all my other clay sculpts, I then sealed the whole thing with paint and varnish to make the surface nice and tough for when I make the moulds. And that is our finished Roadhog mask. If you want to see where this mask goes, if you want to see any of the rest of the costume, because I am making this costume for a friend, so eventually it'll show up somewhere, subscribe to the channel, like this video, let me know you approve of Roadhog, and stick around for future Overwatch cosplay stuff and 3D printed stuff. Thank you and goodbye.